Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Marone for Westchester Talk Radio. And once again, we are with our friends at Hightower Westchester for yet another podcast. And I'm here with Peter Lang. He's the managing director and partner at Hightower Westchester in Harrison, New York. Great to see you, Peter.
Thanks for having me back, and great to see you as well.
Peter, today's topic is one that has affected, and probably will affect almost anyone who's listening to this broadcast. The sandwich generation. First, let's cover the basics. What is the sandwich generation?
Simply put, Bob, when we refer to the sandwich generation, we're talking about the generation that's stuck in the middle of the sandwich, right? Generally, we're talking about the meat in the middle, not the bread on both sides of the sandwich. Typically, so if you think about it this way, you're talking about someone that's probably in their 40s or 50s with their parents, their older parents, 60s, 70s, 80s or older that are still alive, and their young adult children that are probably starting out in the workforce, starting to build their career and build families. Typically, the person with most of the responsibility tends to be female, not surprisingly. The person is potentially a caregiver for their older parents, either both physically caregiving or financially caregiving or both, paying doctor's bills, helping schedule doctor visits, all that kind of fun stuff. And then for their children, she probably isn't, while she's not maybe a caregiver for them, she probably is helping financially support them.
Well, let's take this apart, dive a little deeper, and spend more time on each generation. Let's start with the older generation, Peter, and what is involved. Let's go a little deeper.
Great. So if you think about, having older parents, let's just assume 70s, 80s, 90s or something like that. Chances are, if you're in that age bracket, you're probably starting to have some sort of physical ailments, as well as, unfortunately, some cognitive issues. I unfortunately got to experience this firsthand with my mother-in-law. And as my wife put it to me when I was writing this up and preparing this a week or so ago, she told me it sucked. Were her exact words. So you can quote her on that. But before we moved her parents eventually into an assisted living facility, which was pretty close to us, about 15 or 20 minutes away, her parents lived about an hour plus away. And my wife would spend hours every weekend cooking food. And then she would drive out at least once, if not twice a week to see them. So basically her entire day would be spent driving out to get the food to her parents, spending some time with them, getting them set up, doing whatever else she could do. Now, they did have some help in the house already, but they weren't cooking. And my mother-in-law, unfortunately, was really not able to cook anymore. So, my wife was taking just a lot of time out of her day to do this. And at the same time, she was at the time balancing the needs of our two teenage or preteen daughters at the time. Hey, I helped, but look, I also had a full-time job and did everything that I could do to help. But more of the caregiving responsibilities fell to her. Now, it did get a little easier in our case when they moved into assisted living because my wife didn't have to do any more cooking anymore for them. And they were 20 minutes away as opposed to an hour and 20 minutes away. But she still spent a lot of time there with them. We didn't have any financial responsibilities for my in-laws. They were fine financially. And one of the really good things I did for them, aside from marrying their daughter, was...
they might debate that. But
they probably would debate that. But I did help them purchase a long-term care policy probably about 20 years ago. And that really was a financial lifesaver for them. So I would say the first lesson learned here is, long-term care insurance policies can really be beneficial. And I know, my partner Roman, who's much more of a specialist in this area than I am, I think has done a podcast or two on this topic and has also written some blogs, which are a great reference for anybody that's listening and wants to learn more about it.
Well, before we move on to long-term care, I'd like to add a little bit and ask you to expand on the paperwork. Your wife will tell you that making, moving, changing appointments, completing forms, and then even following up on the various medications, it's a full-time job.
It completely was. I mean, my wife's lucky, she's got a couple of siblings. She has another sister that also has been very helpful and very involved. But it kind of took a village, right? It took all of their kids all doing
really
different
does.
things to help. So thankfully, I don't want to say it all fell onto my wife. A lot of it fell onto my wife, but again, she had other siblings that were able to help with some of the work, as you said, the scheduling doctor's appointments, filling out the paper, all that kind of stuff. Which, yeah, it's tough. It's a lot.
Yeah, you can tell I've been there as well. Moving
I
on.
can.
Anything else on that generation? Finances, long-term care in general. Let's talk about that.
Well, the one thing I've seen and learned firsthand is, the older generation tends to guard their finances kind of like Fort Knox, right? So they don't talk about it. They don't talk about it with their children. So, suddenly if your parents suddenly become unable to do it, now you're thrust into it and you don't even know where to start. Your head is spinning. You've got to now take care of paying all their bills and dealing with their insurance, but you may not even know where anything is. You may not even know where their checkbook is. You may not know who their financial advisor is. Why? Because their parents simply didn't talk about it. It's one of those things, if we don't talk about it, it won't be an issue. So we'll just pretend it doesn't exist. And of course, it is an issue. And part of it is one of the things that I think you kind of have to do is you start, so it's how do you broach the topic? You can't just go up to your mom and your dad who are 85 years old and have never talked to you about it before and say, hey, let's talk about your finances today. They're not about to say, okay, great, I was hoping you'd ask. Let's have that conversation. You kind of have to, like anything else, you have to drip a little bit. You have to be a little persistent, because your parents sometimes still view you as the little child that you were 20, 30, 40 years ago, not as this mature adult that can really be helpful and that ultimately has their best interest at heart. So it's not always easy to broach the topic, and you have to kind of keep at it. And you not only do you need to know who and where their financial advisor is and their bank account, but there are other key documents, things like a power of attorney form, HIPAA forms, healthcare proxies. All of those kind of things are really important. And one little stat just to toss in here, according to an AARP study that was done in 2020, about 54% of adults in the sandwich generation have given more than $1,000 to their parents, and 20% have given more than $5,000, right? So, it's not just the occasional gift of something or other, it's more meaningful financial help.
Wow. In that vein, let's talk about the younger generation. I just would add this. There is this component where you almost switch roles when they get much older or infirm.
Yep.
Let's talk about that.
Yep.
Younger generation.
Yes. So usually now we're talking about the younger generation. I'm not really talking about, your child that might be in high school or college. And if they're in college, yes, they're probably still very much financially dependent on you. They're learning to spread their wings, as I'm seeing with my daughter who's in college now. But financially, look, she's still counting on us to help with tuition and room and board and all that other good stuff. So it's not so much with that age group. It's really more, it's really when they're out of college and in the workforce, right? So their job may not necessarily be covering 100% of their bills, so to speak. Typical, are they still on your cell phone plan? I remember a few years ago, I had a good friend of mine married off his youngest child and realized that she was still on the cell phone plan. So after they came back from the honeymoon, he said, okay, dear, it's time for you guys to have your own cell phone plan. He told me she broke down in tears crying, and he said, never mind. And that was it. And, it's probably 5 or 6 years later, and I would guarantee she's still on the cell phone plan. And then there are things like, Netflix accounts and Uber, is their Uber account hooked up to your credit card? All those little things that we take for granted right now. And then when they do get out of college and let's say they can be and want to be financially independent, but let's say they can only afford an apartment in kind of a bad part of town, right? Are you going to want them to be living in kind of an unsafe area in a 4-story walk-up? Or are you going to pitch in a little bit of money to put them in a doorman building? If they're living in a let's assume a city on this one.
Mhm.
And so that's, part of it is it may not even always be them. It could be you. You may not
Mhm.
want them to be living in X. You want them to live in Y. Well, you're going to have to pay for that difference, right? And the same AARP study that focused on, parents, older, the sandwich helping their parents, same one said about 56% of people gave $1,000 to an adult child, and 25% it was more than 5,000 to an adult child. And one kind of added thought on this AARP survey is, the money that was being sent to either side of the generations,
Mhm.
again, it wasn't a gift. That side of the generation was relying on that money to cover their expenses. Whatever they were putting it towards doesn't matter, but they relied on that couple $1,000s from child or parent to pay their bills.
Yes. I'd like to emphasize this for our listeners and viewers. This is a message that addresses both ends of the sandwich generation. We're talking and calling it the sandwich generation, but hopefully both the meat in the middle and the bread on the ends are listening to this, because it might make their exchanges easier. Peter, this is an awful lot to consider. How can you help with this? What can you do? What can people do?
Well, there are a few ways that we specifically help with this. When we start, let's say we have a new client coming into us, and let's just say they're 50 years old. One of the areas that we start is a financial plan, and we start with our questionnaire. One of the questions we put in there is, do you have the need to financially help either a child or a parent? Do you expect an inheritance? So we're asking on kind of both sides of that question. But when we're talking about the spending side, we'll show them exactly what the effect of, sending $1,000 a month to mom or $1,000 a month to junior will look like, and how it's going to affect and alter their retirement plans, right? That's what we're doing typically, is helping them plan for their retirement. So we look at this as any other expense to help understand how they're doing it. If they tell us, yes, we have a need to help, with our parents in particular, we'll ask them, well, do you know where your parents' finances are? Do you know who they're working with, what bank they use? All of those kind of simple questions that I talked about a few minutes ago. But now we're going to ask them point blank, do you know where this information is? Because you need to find out now, not later. And then we'll also talk about the importance of long-term care at the same time. We've had a couple of cases where we've had a couple of clients actually purchase long-term care insurance or pay for the long-term care insurance for their parents, right? So they don't have the obligation to pay all of these expenses, but they're going to pay the few $1,000s a year in the premium that mom and dad, for whatever reason, either don't want to do or can't afford to do. They're going to make that investment, if you think of it as a child, in their parent to make sure that they'll be taken care of. And then the other part that we also, on the flip side, will ask the question about their child and get to know the younger generation. And, we'll start to ask about that as well, and try to develop that relationship and see where we can help there.
Peter, what does Hightower Westchester do that you think makes a difference?
Bob, thanks. That's a great question. First and foremost, we take a lot of time to get to know our clients. Second, we tend to have long-term relationships with our clients. It's typical for us to have multi-generations of the same family at one time. We actually had, it was really like this one. We had 4 generations at one time of the same family. So from, the oldest to the youngest, to the kids that we were helping save for college, to great grandpa who, he was, 85, 90 years old. It was great. But more typical is a couple of generations. Recently I had a client, his son graduated college, got his first job. He was asking his father about this, what do I do? What do I do with this and that? And the other thing, his father just said, here, call Lang, let him know, speak to him. He'll tell you what to do. So I had a great conversation with him talking about getting a 401k plan, asking these questions, your first apartment, make sure you save some extra money, have a little extra in the bank, so to speak, to take care of some bills. And he said, he really appreciated it. And he said, my father's always said, anything ever happens, call Lang. So having multiple generations in this case. So now I've got a relationship with this young man. And let's fast forward 10, 15, 20 years. Let's say I start to notice that his dad starts to have some cognitive impairment. Now, I may see that almost before he sees it or he notices it. People who have cognitive impairments tend to hide it pretty well, either on purpose or not. And sometimes you don't want to see what you don't want to have to admit. Mm-hmm. So if I have that now multiple generation, I can somehow, either start the idea of let's have a family meeting. Let's get everybody together in the same room. Let's have a family meeting to talk about things that need to be spoken about between the entire family. So I can help kind of broach that sensitive topic, whereas I spoke earlier about the older generation not wanting to say much, guarding their money like it was Fort Knox or the information mm-hmm. about their money. I can sometimes help broach that conversation in a much more subtle way and kind of be a trusted third party. Always our job is to protect our clients, be it the oldest generation to the youngest generation. I have to try to balance out everybody's needs, but I also really have to make sure that everyone is protected from the outside, but also from themselves too. And we take that very seriously.
I know that you do. Peter, one thing that I thought of in this recent segment is there are times when people with cognitive impairments don't have insight into it. This is tough to manage, mm-hmm. very tough to manage. Is that where you come into, or sometimes does a doctor need to be involved? This can get very sticky.
It can get very sticky. And so, sometimes, the doctor might have to get involved. We may have set up a trust for a client, so we may get a corporate trustee involved as needed to help. It all, depends on the situation and the particular dynamic of the family. Are there children or grandchildren that are able to kind of step in and help manage the situation? And, my job is to try to connect that and make that happen, as seamlessly as possible.
Any final comments, Peter?
No, it's just, realize that like many other things, you are not alone, right? If you're that sandwich, if you're the meat in the middle, as I started during the conversation, you're not the first person to be in that position. You probably have friends that have lived through it. You have colleagues from work, and you probably have your financial advisor that can be a resource as well. Reach out to those people and seek their help and advice. You don't have to do this on your own.
No, you do not. And Peter, I'm hoping that the next time we do this, before I say goodbye, that we get to do it in person. Thank you so much again.
Me too. Take care, Bob.
All right. Take care. Peter Lang, Managing Director and Partner at Hightower Westchester in Harrison. Thank you so much.
Hightower Westchester is a group of investment professionals registered with Hightower Securities LLC, member FINRA and SIPC, and with Hightower Advisors LLC, a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities LLC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors LLC. This is not an offer to buy or sell securities. No investment process is free of risk, and there is no guarantee that the investment process or the investment opportunities referenced herein will be profitable. Past performance is not indicative of current or future performance and is not a guarantee. The investment opportunities referenced herein may not be suitable for all investors. All data and information referenced herein are from sources believed to be reliable. Any opinions, news, research, analyses, prices, or other information contained in this research is provided as a general market commentary. It does not constitute investment advice. Hightower Westchester and Hightower shall not in any way be liable for claims and make no expressed or implied representations or warranties as to the accuracy or completeness of the data and other information, or for statements or errors contained in or omissions from the obtained data and information referenced herein. The data and information are provided as of the date referenced. Such data and information are subject to change without notice. This podcast was created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed are solely those of Hightower Westchester and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors LLC or any of its affiliates. Hightower Advisors do not provide tax or legal advice. This material was not intended or written to be used or presented to any entity as tax advice or tax information. Tax laws vary based on the client's individual circumstances and can change at any time without notice. Clients are urged to consult their tax or legal advisor before establishing a retirement plan.